It was another quiet night on the streets. Officer Jenkins was on his usual patrol, driving through the dimly lit parking lot of an old strip mall. The headlights of his patrol car cut through the darkness, and the soft hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the air. As he passed the rows of parked cars, something caught his eye. A vehicle that seemed out of place. It was an old, beaten-up sedan, parked near the far corner of the lot, away from the other cars. The windows were slightly rolled down, and the car looked empty at first glance. Officer Jenkins slowed his patrol car, his instincts kicking in. Something about the car didn't sit right with him. He was used to seeing all kinds of things during his shifts, but this felt different. The vehicle was still, almost too still. He parked his car a few spaces away, his eyes narrowing as he watched the sedan. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A man slowly leaned forward in the driver's seat, rubbing his eyes as if trying to wake up from a long nap. The man appeared tired, his clothes wrinkled and dirty, his hair unkempt. Officer Jenkins couldn't make out many details from a distance, but something told him this wasn't just a man resting after a long day. He put the car in park and stepped out, his boots making a soft thud against the asphalt. His hand instinctively went to the radio on his belt, but he paused, deciding to approach the situation cautiously. The man hadn't noticed him yet, so Officer Jenkins took a few steps toward the sedan. As he got closer, he could see the veteran's worn-out face. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression unreadable. The officer noticed the telltale signs of someone who had been through something difficult. He had seen it before, too many times. The officer cleared his throat to announce his presence. "Hey there," he called out. The man didn't respond at first, still looking out the windshield, lost in his thoughts. Jenkins repeated himself, a little louder this time. "Hey, I need you to roll down the window for me." The veteran slowly turned his head, his eyes blinking rapidly as if he was trying to focus. He rolled down the window just a crack, his movements slow and deliberate. Officer Jenkins stepped closer, keeping his voice calm, but firm. "Can I see your ID?" he asked. He needed to make sure everything was okay, but there was something about this situation that felt off. The veteran didn't immediately respond. He just sat there, staring at the officer as if he didn't understand the question. It was as if he didn't recognize the authority standing before him. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," Officer Jenkins said again, his tone now more commanding. The veteran's hand shook as he gripped the steering wheel, and the officer could see the tension in his posture. The man's lips parted, but it wasn't to comply. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, his voice barely audible. I can't go back," he said, as though the words didn't quite make sense. Officer Jenkins paused, trying to figure out what the veteran meant. Was he afraid of going to jail? Or was there something deeper at play? His mind raced, and a knot formed in his stomach. He had been a cop long enough to sense when things weren't as they seemed. This wasn't just a simple case of someone breaking the law. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. He took a step back, his hand still on his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. But before he did, he decided to hold off for a moment, watching the veteran closely. This was more than just an arrest. He could feel it. The veteran's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as Officer Jenkins stood there, watching him carefully. His eyes flickered back and forth, never fully meeting the officer's gaze. There was a nervous energy around him, a quiet unease that was almost palpable. Jenkins couldn't help but notice the veteran's unkempt appearance, the worn-out jacket, the dark bags under his eyes, the way he seemed to shrink into his seat, as if trying to avoid being seen. The officer took a step closer, trying to keep his tone calm and non-threatening. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice steady but firm. "I can help you, but I need you to cooperate." The veteran flinched at the sound of the command, his whole body tensing. He was trapped in his own thoughts, lost somewhere deep inside his mind. The officer noticed his shaky hands and the way his shoulders seemed to slump under some invisible weight. There was a flicker of something in the veteran's eyes, a mixture of fear and confusion. But still, he didn't move. Jenkins took a deep breath, trying to read the situation. He had dealt with all kinds of people, drunk drivers, angry pedestrians, even criminals on the run. But this man was different. There was something beneath the surface. The officer's instincts told him that the situation wasn't what it appeared to be. This wasn't just a man in trouble. It was someone who was broken. Someone who had seen and felt things no one should ever have to experience. The silence stretched between them, the air thick with tension. Jenkins took another step forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm just trying to help you. I don't want this to get out of hand. Please, just step out of the car." The veteran's eyes darted around, avoiding the officer's stare. Then, suddenly, his voice broke through the silence. It was low, strained, as if speaking was a struggle. "I can't go back. I can't. I just can't," he whispered, his words hanging in the air. There was something about the way he said it that made Jenkins pause. "What do you mean?" Jenkins asked gently, not wanting to push too hard but needing to understand. The veteran didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared ahead, his eyes clouded with something the officer couldn't quite place. Jenkins took another step closer, this time reaching for the door handle. He needed to keep the situation from escalating, but he wasn't sure how to move forward. The veteran's refusal to cooperate wasn't just about the law. It felt personal, like a deeper struggle that went beyond the simple act of disobedience. Finally, the veteran looked up, his face a mix of shame and fear. He opened his mouth again, but this time, his words came out more clearly, though still shaky. "I served in Iraq. I've seen things. I can't go back to that place. I can't." The veteran trailed off, his voice cracking. Jenkins stood there, taken aback by the sudden shift in the conversation. The veteran was talking about his time in the military. Iraq. The weight of those words hit Jenkins hard. This wasn't just a troubled individual. This was someone who had fought for his country, someone who had lived through unimaginable trauma. The officer's posture softened, his suspicion replaced by empathy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jenkins could see it in the veteran's face. The exhaustion, the pain, the haunted look in his eyes. He was clearly struggling, not just with the present, but with everything that had come before. Jenkins realized that this wasn't about arresting someone. This was about understanding a person who had been broken by war. The veteran sat back in his seat, his fingers still lightly gripping the wheel, but now there was a different energy about him. It wasn't the tight, panicked grasp from before. It was looser, like he was starting to let go of some of the weight he had been carrying. Jenkins noticed the change. The tension in the veteran's shoulders had softened, and for the first time in this conversation, he seemed more present, more aware of the moment they were sharing. Jenkins knew that this wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't a magic solution that could make everything better in a single conversation. The veteran's journey, the pain he had endured, wasn't something that could be undone overnight. But there was a spark of something here, something that Jenkins hadn't seen earlier. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was the first crack in the armor the veteran had built around himself. "I don't know where to start," the veteran said quietly, his voice still shaky but carrying a new sense of vulnerability. "I don't know how to even begin." Jenkins leaned against the side of the car, his arms crossed. "You don't have to know everything right now," he replied. "Sometimes just taking that first step is enough. You don't have to have it all figured out." The veteran let out a slow breath and looked out the window, his gaze distant once again. For a moment, Jenkins thought the man might pull back into himself, retreat into that space of isolation he had inhabited for so long. But this time, something different happened. The veteran turned his head, and there was a spark of something in his eyes, something that looked like curiosity. "I've never really thought about it that way," the veteran admitted. "I always thought I had to have everything under control, like I had to fix myself alone." Jenkins gave him a small nod. "It's a hard lesson to learn," he said, "but no one can do it alone." Not really. We all need help from time to time. And asking for it doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong in a different way. The veteran looked down at his hands, turning them over as if examining them for the first time. There was a long pause before he spoke again, this time with a hint of self-doubt creeping into his voice. "What if I fail?" he asked, his eyes searching the officer's face as though looking for reassurance. "What if asking for help doesn't work? What if I just keep messing everything up?" Jenkins could feel the veteran's fear, the doubt that still clung to him like a shadow. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. This man wasn't defined by his mistakes or his struggles. He was defined by his strength, his ability to keep going, even when the world seemed too heavy. "Failure doesn't define you," Jenkins said, his voice calm but firm. "It's what you do after failure that matters. It's the decision to keep fighting, to keep trying, that makes you who you are. You don't have to get it perfect. You just have to keep moving forward, one step at a time." The veteran's eyes softened as he took in the officer's words. He still looked uncertain, but there was something else there now. Maybe a little less fear, maybe just a hint of something like belief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Jenkins hope. "All right," the veteran said slowly, as if testing the idea in his mind. I'll think about it. Maybe I'll give it a shot." Jenkins smiled, a small but sincere smile. "That's all I'm asking for," he said. "Just a shot. And when you're ready, I'll be here." As the veteran sat there, deep in thought, Jenkins could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about a man getting help. It was about breaking through the isolation, about letting someone in. And for the first time in a long while, the veteran seemed willing to take that chance. The veteran looked at Officer Jenkins with a mix of disbelief and guarded hope. It was clear the man didn't know what to believe anymore. But the officer's words seemed to reach him in a way no one else had. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in the veteran's eyes. Maybe it was trust, or maybe it was just the first step toward allowing himself to hope again. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt peaceful, like the weight of the world was slowly starting to lift from the veteran's shoulders. He still didn't say anything, but there was a change in his posture. He wasn't as tense as before. He didn't look as if he were preparing to flee or fight. Instead, he just sat there, hands still gripping the steering wheel, but with a slightly softer look in his eyes. Officer Jenkins stood there for a few seconds, watching the veteran carefully. He knew that this moment could go in many different directions. It could still end in a confrontation, or it could end with this man finding a bit of peace, at least for now. Jenkins wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was about something far more important than following protocol. Finally, the veteran spoke again. His voice was shaky, but it carried a quiet strength. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can face it," he said, his words slow and measured. "The nightmares, they never stop. The faces of the ones I lost, they're always with me." Officer Jenkins felt his heart tighten. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from the man standing before him made it all the more real. The officer had seen the scars of war on the outside, on the physical bodies of soldiers, but hearing this man speak of the scars on the inside was different. Those scars were invisible, yet far deeper, and they didn't heal as easily. "I can't imagine what it's like," Jenkins said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I do know this. What you went through, it matters. Your life matters. And you deserve help, not just for what you've done, but for who you are now. You don't have to keep it all inside. You don't have to carry it alone." The veteran's eyes closed for a moment, his breathing slow and steady. It was as if the officer's words had reached him in a way no one else's had before. For a brief second, the veteran seemed to relax, as if considering the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. But then, just as quickly, the walls came back up. The man's shoulders tensed once more, and he looked down at his hands, the same uncertainty clouding his expression. "I don't know. I'm not sure I'm worth saving," he muttered. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was loud enough for Jenkins to hear the pain in it. The officer understood that this wasn't just about pride or shame. It was about a man who had lost so much. He didn't know if there was anything left to save. "Listen," Jenkins said, leaning in a little closer. "You don't have to do this by yourself. You've already fought for your country. You've given more than most people ever will. But now, it's time for you to let others help you. You've earned that right. And you deserve a chance to find peace." The veteran didn't respond immediately, but something in his expression softened just a little. Jenkins could see it, just a flicker of recognition. Maybe, just maybe, the man was beginning to believe that help wasn't as far away as he thought. The veteran sat in his car, his hand still gripping the wheel as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His eyes remained fixed on the dashboard, his thoughts clearly far away. Jenkins stood there quietly, watching him, unsure of what to say next. He could tell the veteran was deep in thought, his mind likely racing through memories that were too painful to relive. But something had changed in the air between them. There was no anger now, no hostility, just two people trying to understand each other. The officer took a deep breath, realizing that he couldn't push this man too hard. It had to be at the veteran's pace, at his own time. Jenkins knew that it wasn't his job to fix the man's past, but perhaps in this moment, he could offer a glimpse of a different future. "I know it's not easy," Jenkins said softly, his voice low and steady. "But I'm here for you. Whenever you're ready to talk, to take the next step, I'll be here." The words weren't a promise to fix everything. They were a promise to listen, to offer support, to make sure the veteran didn't feel completely alone. It was all he could offer, but sometimes that was enough. The veteran had been fighting his inner demons for so long, and just knowing someone was there for him could make all the difference. The silence stretched on between them again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't filled with tension or uncertainty. It was a quiet understanding, a shared space where both men could just be, without any pressure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the veteran spoke, his voice so soft that Jenkins almost didn't hear it. "I don't know how to trust people anymore," he admitted. "I've lost too much, and I'm scared of losing more." Jenkins nodded, his heart heavy with empathy. "I understand," he said quietly, "but you don't have to do it all on your own. You don't have to be afraid of getting help, of reaching out." The veteran turned his head slowly, his eyes locking with the officer's. There was a deep sadness in those eyes, but there was something else too. Maybe it was a flicker of hope, maybe just a hint of possibility. For the first time since they had started talking, the veteran didn't look completely lost. "I don't know if I can go to a hospital or a therapist," the veteran said, almost to himself. "It feels like admitting defeat, like I'm weak." Jenkins shook his head, understanding exactly what the man meant. "It's not weakness," he replied firmly. "It takes more strength to ask for help than to keep everything bottled up. You've already shown strength by surviving. But now, it's okay to let others help carry some of that weight." The veteran was quiet for a long time after that. His eyes were distant, as if he were processing the officer's words. Jenkins didn't rush him, knowing that this wasn't a conversation that could be solved in a few minutes. It would take time, patience, and trust, things that the veteran had lost somewhere along the way, but maybe, just maybe, could be rebuilt. Finally, the veteran let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as if he had released some of the tension that had been building up inside him. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to try something different." The officer gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Whenever you're ready," Jenkins said, his voice calm and steady. "You're not alone in this." For the first time in a long while, the veteran didn't feel like he had to carry everything on his own. Maybe this was the first step to healing. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to take it. The quiet moment between them stretched on a little longer, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air. The veteran still sat in the car, but there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor. The anger and frustration that had been so clear earlier were no longer present. Instead, there was a calmness, a tentative peace that was settling over him, even if it was just for now. Jenkins could see it in his face, in the way he seemed to breathe a little easier. The officer took a step back, giving the man the space he needed. He understood that this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. It was only a small step, a moment of connection. But sometimes, that's all it took to change everything. People didn't heal all at once. It happened in pieces, and sometimes, the first piece was just allowing someone else to help carry the burden. "I think I'm gonna head home," the veteran said finally, his voice quieter now, but with a new sense of resolve. It wasn't the same man who had first spoken to Jenkins, the one who had been so closed off and defensive. This man seemed different, softer, more open. There was a new kind of courage in his eyes, and that made all the difference. Jenkins nodded, but didn't say anything at first. He knew the veteran wasn't asking for permission, but it felt important to give him that space to make the choice for himself. "Take it one day at a time," the officer said, his tone gentle but sincere. "There's no rush. You don't have to figure everything out right away." The veteran gave a small nod, his eyes briefly meeting the officer's. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was an unspoken promise. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point, he'd take that first step. "Thanks," the veteran said quietly, the words carrying a weight of gratitude that was almost too heavy for his voice. "I didn't expect this. Didn't expect someone to just listen." Jenkins smiled softly, his eyes full of understanding. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he said. "Someone to listen. Someone to remind you that you're not alone." The veteran seemed to take those words to heart, and for a long moment, he just sat there, as if processing everything that had happened. He hadn't expected to open up today, hadn't expected to find any kind of relief. But somehow, in this brief encounter with a stranger, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was missing: human connection. As the veteran started his car and slowly pulled away, Jenkins stood there for a moment, watching him disappear down the road. He didn't know what the future held for the man, but for the first time in a long time, he had a glimmer of hope. The veteran wasn't alone anymore. Maybe he would take that step, maybe he wouldn't, but the officer knew one thing for sure: this moment mattered. And that's where it all started. Jenkins turned back toward his patrol car, his heart a little lighter. He had done his job, but more than that, he had done something far more important. He had offered a piece of himself, a piece of humanity that had broken through the walls of pain and distrust. And in that small moment, that made all the difference. The officer stood quietly, letting the veteran's words hang in the air. The man's face was pale, his eyes staring at nothing in particular. It was as if the world around him had disappeared, and all that was left were the painful memories of the past. Jenkins didn't say anything right away. Instead, he let the silence linger, giving the veteran a chance to gather himself. The veteran swallowed hard and took a shaky breath, as if summoning the courage to say more. "I didn't just fight in Iraq," he said slowly, his voice trembling. I lost people, friends, brothers in arms. I was there when they died. I saw it. I felt it, and I don't know how to get rid of it." Jenkins felt a lump form in his throat. It was becoming clear to him now. This wasn't just about someone breaking the law or causing a scene. This was someone who had been broken by the horrors of war, someone who had come back home to a world that couldn't understand what he'd been through. His eyes softened as he looked at the man before him. The anger and frustration he had initially felt began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of understanding. The veteran's hands shook as he reached up to rub his face, as if trying to wipe away the memories that haunted him. He seemed lost in thought, his mind racing with all the pain he had carried with him since coming back from Iraq. "I thought I could leave it all behind," the veteran continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't go away. It never does. Jenkins took a step closer, his voice gentle but firm. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to do this alone. You're not the only one who's been through something like this." The words felt strange to him, but in the moment, they felt right. He had seen countless veterans over the years, but this was different. There was a real, raw pain in this man's eyes, and Jenkins realized that maybe the man wasn't just struggling with his past. He was also struggling with the present, and with a sense of abandonment that seemed to weigh him down. The veteran blinked, finally meeting Jenkins's gaze for the first time. His eyes were filled with a mix of disbelief and something else. Hope, maybe. But it was quickly replaced with doubt. "I can't trust anyone," he muttered. "I don't even trust myself. I don't know what's real anymore." Jenkins nodded, understanding more than he let on. He had seen the same look in the eyes of so many others. People who had returned from war and couldn't find their place in a world that had moved on without them. The officer knew it wasn't just a matter of following orders or upholding the law. It was about showing this man that he mattered, that his story mattered, and that there were people who cared. The silence between them stretched out once more, but this time it felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of shared understanding. Jenkins could feel the weight of the veteran's pain, and he knew that this wasn't just about making an arrest anymore. It was about reaching out, about offering something more than just a ticket or a warning. "Look," Jenkins said, his voice softer now. "I'm not going to arrest you. I can't pretend to understand everything you've been through, but I can listen. And if you'll let me, I can help you get the help you need. You don't have to do this alone." The veteran's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but something in his expression softened. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone.